Cutouts are the easiest method for creating fondant decorations, and the sky is the limit for what you can create. So here I have a small ball of fondant, which I'm gonna roll out and cut. There's a few tools you'll need. All right, so I'm going to unwrap my little piece of fondant, sprinkle just a little bit of powdered sugar on my surface. If you're in a more humid climate, you might want to use some cornstarch. Then I'm just going to kind of gently press my little piece of fondant, cover it with some of the sugar, and start rolling. You can also, if you prefer, work directly on a piece of parchment paper. You might want to tape the four corners of your piece of parchment paper down to your table so that it will stay secure as you're rolling. So this is a small rolling pin made of plastic that's used for fondant. It's great when you want to roll just a small piece of fondant. It gives you a lot more control than using a really large, typical kitchen rolling pin. So I'm going to roll this sheet of fondant pretty thin because I'm going to be cutting out some pretty small decorations. So the larger your decoration, the thicker you might want your fondant so that whatever decoration you're making has a little bit of stability and structure. And the smaller your decoration, perhaps the thinner you'd like your sheet. Fondant decorations are a really great way to utilize leftover scraps that you have of colored fondant. So whenever you're working with coloring fondant, anytime you have any little bits left over, just wrap them up really well. If you plan on storing them for a while, you can even slip them into a zip top bag. And then next time you go to decorate a cake, let's say you need some green leaves, perhaps you have some green left over from another cake you used. Okay, so now I've got this nice thin sheet. It's about 1/8 of an inch or so thick. And I'm gonna cut out some circles using pastry tips. So oftentimes you might have things already in your kitchen or in your home that you can use as cutters that you don't necessarily need to go out and buy more. So in this case, if I want to make little small dots, I'll just use the top of my pastry tip. And I'll just use my fingertip to kind of gently knock them out of my cutter. I could also use the backside of my pastry tip and make larger circles. Circles, of course, are great for all sorts of designs. They can be fun and festive, and you can create something that looks a bit like confetti on a cake, or you can also use them for a very modern, more geometric and clean look on your cake. If this sort of thing happens, like whatever your cutout is gets stuck in your cutter, what you can do is you can actually dip your cutter in a bit of powdered sugar or cornstarch, knock away the excess, and then cut out another piece. And oftentimes that'll help slide them out of the cutter more easily. If you ever cut something out that has a lot of fine detail, you might actually use a toothpick to press it out of your cutter. Also, if you ever cut something with a cutter and it doesn't completely tear away, you can either use a little toothpick or a paring knife to sort of trim away the edge from your sheet. So when you're making fondant cutout decorations, you really want to only roll a very small amount of fondant at a time. This is because once you roll this out, you have quite a bit of surface area and your fondant is just gonna start drying out. So if you roll a really big sheet and try to cut out hundreds of something, by the time you get through just a small section of your fondant, it's gonna start to dry. As you cut your shapes, they'll start to crack and they just won't look very good. So start small, punch out a few decorations, and then roll another little piece, punch out a few decorations. All these little scraps, you can just kind of ball up, add a little bit of shortening to them if they feel kind of dry, knead them, and roll again. If while you're working on your decorations, you need to pause, you can always take a piece of plastic wrap and just lay this right over the top. I don't recommend doing this for very long, but if you need to take a break for a few minutes, that's perfectly fine. And this will kind of help keep your decorations nice and moist so they don't dry out too much. So when you're working with fondant cutouts, if they're really large and you need them to kind of curve around your round cake, or maybe they're going to lay over the top edge of your cake, then you want to apply them to your cake while they're still moist. So you're going to be kind of cutting applying to your cake. Cutting, applying to your cake. However, if it doesn't matter if some of the pieces that are smaller maybe dry completely firm before you apply them to your cake, then all you need to do is put them on a plate or maybe in a bakery box or somewhere where they'll be safe and just let them sit out at room temperature. They can have exposure to air and they'll dry firm. So writing on cakes can be quite challenging, which is why I really like rolling out fondant and using letter cutters, so that I can put a message on a cake that looks really nice, super clean, and it's actually really simple. So I'm going to just get a little bit powdered sugar on my station and sprinkle a little bit more on top and roll out my fondant. You can find cutters in any shape, design you can imagine, which is pretty cool because it really means that you can kind of create a cake with any sort of theme you'd like. There's lots of cutters that you can find online or at craft stores. It's really great that there's just so much out there these days. So I'm gonna roll this quite thin because I'm gonna be cutting relatively small letters. You could also find letter cutters with all different kinds of fonts, which is pretty neat too. So now that I have a nice thin sheet of fondant, I'm going to cut out the H in my happy birthday. So I'm gonna dip this cutter into some sugar before I cut because it's got lots of little lines and lots of little cuts, and it's likely that this is gonna stick. I'll cut this out and then use a little spatula and just gently press it out of my cutter. When you're cutting letters, or any other decorations that have lots of detail, cutters with loads and loads of little detail, it's very likely that your design will get stuck either in the cutter or as you're cutting, you might find that you don't cut all the way through. So I'm gonna intentionally press this cutter through my fondant, but I'm not gonna cut all the way through the entire thing, so I can show you kind of how to work around that. So when you have something with a lot of detail, oftentimes it's actually better, instead of lifting out your cutter, to pull the fondant away from your cutter. And that'll help you get a nice clean edge. And then we'll take something that doesn't have too sharp of an edge, just kind of push this out. If you're using a toothpick or something like this that has a point to push your decorations out of your cutter, just be careful that you don't pierce holes into it. I kind of aim for the edge of the interior of my cutter. Just gently kind of press this out. Oftentimes, if you have a letter that has an interior cutout, like this A does, that might not cut all the way through. So then you can take a paring knife or an X-Acto blade and just gently kind of trim this out. Take your time with this. If you don't like the results, just cut another one. They don't take much time at all. If you do find that it is taking you quite a while to work on a cutter, perhaps you have a snowflake that's got lots of detail, then while your sheet of fondant is waiting for its next cut, make sure you cover it up with some plastic so it doesn't dry out. I'll just punch the center of my A out. Lay these on a nice flat surface, and then if there's any bits of powdered sugar or if you're using cornstarch on them, you can just kind of brush that away with a dry paintbrush a little bit later. So I'm just gonna go ahead and cut the rest of my letters. So now I'm gonna show you using a plastic cutter in the shape of a flower. As you can see, cutters come in every shape and design you can imagine. So since this one has lots of little petals, I'm gonna make sure I dip it in some sugar so that it won't stick. And this is the type of cutter that I'm going to place on my fondant, and really, because it's got lots of little lines that need to cut through, I'm gonna make sure I apply really firm pressure all the way around. And instead of lifting up my cutter, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull away the fondant around my cutter. This is gonna help ensure that as I lift up my cutter, none of these little thin petals tear off. And from there, I have my flower. If it's not perfect, Oftentimes, especially in tiny little openings like that, you might need to kind of go in and clean it up with a little bit of a paring knife. Just some gentle pressure. You can also use a toothpick or something like that for this. And then when you're lifting up something like this that has lots of thin decorations or lots of little thin components that don't have a lot of structure to them, you might want to use an offset spatula just to gently kind of loosen them, loosen your decoration from your countertop, or if you're working on parchment paper, it's usually a little bit easier to lift things up so it doesn't stick quite as much. And then from here, if whatever you're working with loses its shape, not to worry, because while your fondant is still soft, you can actually just move it back into place. And now another thing that's really fun to do with cutouts is you can actually overlap things. So I'm gonna take a paintbrush and just grab a tiny little bit of shortening, paint a little bit in the center. That's gonna be my glue. You can take another piece that you cut out, just press it right in the center. So you can do all kinds of different things with fondant. You can just do single layered decorations, multi-layered, and have lots of fun with them. So I encourage you to play around with cutouts using proper cutters or any other random things you might find at home and have fun.